Hello and welcome back to another episode of Low Spec Labs. In this video we'll be covering chapter 23 of Sander Van Voigt's RHCSA EX200, how to manage Linux firewalls. Before we get started, I would like to stop and say thank you. Thank you for tuning in, thank you for subscribing, and thank you for commenting. If you're new to the channel and would like to keep receiving this content, please go ahead and hit subscribe below. Otherwise, let's get started. I like to start these videos with questions because it's often easier to remember information when you provide that information as something that people have to think about first. That prompts the question, what is a firewall? A firewall is a network utility that controls traffic going in and out of your network. This could either be traffic going from your local network to your server or from the internet to your local network. Firewalls can either be hardware devices or software installed on your operating system. Android phones, iPhones, Macs, and Windows computers all have firewalls, and Linux has had firewalls basically since its inception. Your Linux server uses a software-based firewall. What that means is there is a module attached to the Linux kernel that provides firewall functionality. On older versions of Linux, this module is controlled using IP tables. On newer versions of Red Hat Linux, it is NFT tables, and there is actually a number of different utilities we can use to manage the NFT tables. NF tables, as well as many other firewalls, work off of the concept of zones. What is a firewall zone? A firewall zone is basically a logical construct. It is a collection of rules that your firewall uses while it's inspecting the IP packets that are coming in and out of it. What are the default firewall zones on a Linux server? Well, there's 9 of them. So let's walk through them real quick. So let's go over the different firewall zones. The first is block. By default, it blocks most connections, but it will be nice enough to give you an error message. Only some connections will be allowed, and you'll have to tell the firewall that. Then we have DMZ. This should be used on DMZ servers. With the DMZ zone, only some connections are accepted, and you're going to have limited access to internal network. The next zone you want to know about is drop. Drop is another default deny zone, so connections in the drop zone will be dropped. The only difference is you will not get an error message on the sender's end. After that, we have external zone. The external zone is used on networks where you have NAT enabled. The external zone is often used on routers, and only certain connections on the external zone are accepted, and you're going to have to configure that in the firewall. We have home, which is obviously used for your home networks. Most connections on that same network will be trusted. Some inbound connections to the home network will be trusted, but you'll have to configure that in the firewall. Internal is a lot like home, where it's used on internal networks, and most of the connections on the network will be trusted. Some inbound connections will be trusted, but you have to configure that on the firewall. We then have public. Again, public is used for public networks. The difference between public and something like home or internal, with public networks, most computers on the network are not trusted because it's a public network. However, you can configure some inbound connections to be trusted. So if you had like another device on the public network and you wanted to share files, you could configure that. The next zone is trusted, and basically with the trusted zone, all connections on that zone are accepted. And the last is the work zone, where most computers on the work zone will be trusted, and some inbound connections will be trusted, but that will have to be configured. So we know one piece of information we need for us to configure our Linux firewalls, and that is the default firewall zones. We're also going to need to know the name of the utility to manage firewalls. That utility is called Firewall CMD. Firewall CMD is the command line tool to manage the Firewall D service on Linux servers. Keep in mind that Firewall D is not the same thing as System D. How do you manage Firewall D? We've got our terminal session pulled up here. Let's go ahead and get started with the example. First, we start by listing our services. We can do that with firewall cmd --get services. And you'll notice it then lists all the current firewall cmd services. So these are all the different services that are currently configured in the firewall. It gets this list of services from XML files. These XML files are located in user lib firewall d services. And as you can see, the name of all these XML files correlate with the different services that are listed in firewall d. What does one of these files actually look like when you open it up? Well, let's take a look at an example. Here's what we can do. We can do cat user lib firewall d services, and then let's look at the ftp.xml. And as you can see, inside that XML file, we have the XML definition header. We then define a service, which is FTP. We give it a description, and then we give it a port, which is TCP21 right here. And then we close our description, and there we go. That's enough context to figure out what exactly the commands are going to be doing. Let's go ahead and practice creating our first firewall rule. So first things first, we do firewall cmd get default zone. So as you can see, our default zone is public. To get all the zones we currently have available, we can do firewall cmd --get zones. And as you can see right here, these are all the different zones we currently have configured on the server. So we know how to get the firewall zones. How do we get the current services running on our system? We do firewall cmd --get services. And once again, it lists all the different services we can configure with the firewall right here. So if you've ever configured something like a sonic wall or Fortinet, these are equivalent to service objects inside of those. So the service objects normally hold like a protocol and a port, and we give that a name. This does the same thing. How do you get the services that are available in your current zone? Again, we use firewall cmd get. This time though, we use list services. And as you can see, these are the current services that are tied to the public zone. If we were to run that command again, but specify the zone, so we can do firewall cmd --list services --zone equals, let's do trusted for our zone. As you can see, the trusted zone has no defaults applied. Let's try. As you can see, the lists of the services available in the home zone is different from the list of services available in public. What if we wanted to get even more information about a zone? Well, we can do firewall cmd -list all. And as you can see, it gives us the default zone because we didn't specify one, but it gives us a lot more information about that default zone, like what interface it's tied to, what services are running, what ports and protocols are open, if forwarding is enabled, if NAT is enabled, and lots of other stuff. How do we add a firewall rule using the firewall cmd command? That's pretty straightforward. We can do firewall cmd -add service, and then we can just type in the service name. So for instance, we're going to go with FTP. Now, when we do firewall cmd list all, you'll notice in our default public zone right here, we now have an additional service of FTP. What if we wanted to add a exception to the firewall using the port and protocol number instead of a service object? Let's find out. So in order for us to add a port and protocol directly to a zone, we use the firewall cmd command, and then we do add port, and then we type in the port number and the protocol type. Now if we were to do firewall cmd, or rather list all, you can see here that we have a port 2020 now open on that firewall zone. What if we wanted to remove that port we just added? To remove a port, we can simply do firewall cmd dash remove port, and then we can do 2020 TCP. Then if we were to do firewalls CMD list all, you'll see that port is now missing inside of our firewall zone. All the changes we just made were technically part of the running config of your firewall. What that means is if we were to restart the firewall service or restart the server, all the rules we just added would be deleted and it would go back to whatever we had configured. So how do we make our changes permanent? Thankfully, there's a command for that. To do that, all we'd have to do is firewall cmd -- runtime to permanent. And as you can see, we get a success message. And what that means is now if we were to reboot our server or restart the firewall CMD service, our config changes would be saved. And the reason they do this is because you might accidentally lock yourself out of your server and not be able to re-access it. So it's nice to have the changes be made in a temporary config. So if you make a bad change, all you have to do is either restart the server or restart the service and you're back up. And that's it for chapter 23, a relatively short chapter with some basic simple concepts. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Low Spec Labs. I'm looking forward to finishing this book with you. We have chapter 24 up next, right, in which we are going to be talking about network mounts. So a lot of fun. That was something I played with a few years ago. So this will be a little bit of a review. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day.